the world dissolved into a cacophony of splintering wood and screams. One moment, Margaret Walker was standing in line at the Patterson Mercantile Bank, clutching her meager savings. The next, she was pressed against the cold marble floor, and the scent of gunpowder and bitter fear stinging her nostrils. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, piercing the sudden gloom, illuminated by the black smoke coiling from a pistol's barrel. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice purred, cutting through the panic with chilling elegance. "A contribution, if you please, for the continued prosperity of me." Margaret risked a glance, her head barely lifting from the floor. Three men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, were forcing the tellers to empty their cash drawers into canvas sacks. But the fourth man, the leader, wore no mask. He stood near the center of the room, a silhouette of calm authority amidst the chaos. He was handsome, with a sharp jawline and eyes the color of a winter sky, glinting with a terrifying mixture of amusement and contempt. He moved with a dancer's grace, his long coat swirling around his boots as he surveyed his work. A child began to cry, a high, thin wail of terror. The leader's gaze flickered towards the sound, his smile tightening. "Hush now," he said, his voice dropping to a silken threat. "We wouldn't want to spoil this lovely afternoon." The mother clapped a hand over her child's mouth, her own eyes wide with horror. It was in that moment of shared silent terror that the leader's gaze swept the room and locked onto Margaret's. For a fraction of a second their eyes met. She saw everything in that look: the cold calculation, the absolute lack of remorse, the flicker of recognition that she was seeing his true face. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a private acknowledgement between them that was more terrifying than any shouted command. The robbery was over in minutes. The men were ghosts, vanishing into the sun-bleached street as quickly as they had appeared. The bank erupted into a delayed wave of sobs and shouts. But Margaret remained frozen on the floor. The image of the leader's face burned into her mind. The town marshal arrived, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, huffing and puffing as he tried to impose order. "Did anyone see their faces?" he bellowed, his voice straining. A few people shook their heads, others mumbled about bandanas. Margaret felt a knot of civic duty tighten in her chest. She had seen him. She had to speak up. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling. "I did," she said, her voice small but clear. "The leader, he didn't wear a mask." The marshal turned to her, his expression a mixture of relief and impatience. "Well, what did he look like?" Before she could answer, a different voice cut in sharp and accusatory. It was Mr. Abernathy, the bank manager, his face pale and his finger pointing directly at her. She was in on it." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Margaret. "What?" she stammered, confusion warring with a rising tide of dread. "No, I saw her," Abernathy insisted, his voice cracking. "Just before they came in, she slipped a note to the leader. She gave them the signal." It was a lie, a blatant, impossible lie. But in the frantic aftermath, fear was more persuasive than truth. Whispers ignited like brush fire. Someone mentioned she was just a kitchen girl from the boarding house, an outsider. Someone else swore they'd seen her talking to a stranger in the alley behind the saloon just yesterday. The narrative was built in seconds, a fiction spun from panic and prejudice. The marshal's gaze hardened, suspicion replacing relief. "Is this true, miss?" "No, of course not. I was just standing in line." Margaret's voice was drowned out by the growing clamor. The leader had planned this. That knowing look he'd given her wasn't just a threat. It was a sentence. He had chosen his scapegoat. By seeing his face, she had become the perfect shield for his escape. She saw the look in the marshal's eyes, the shift from protector to accuser. She saw the townspeople, their faces, a gallery of fear and judgment closing in. There would be no trial, no chance to explain. There would be a cell, a mob, a rope. Panic, cold, and absolute seized her. She wasn't a fighter, but survival was a primal instinct. While the marshal was distracted by another witness, she took her chance. She bolted. Shoving past a stunned woman, she burst through the swinging doors of the bank and into the blinding sunlight. She didn't look back. She ran, her satchel bumping against her hip, the shouts of "Stop her" and "Thief" chasing her down the dusty street. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs screamed, diving into the labyrinth of alleys and backways she knew from her daily errands. She didn't stop running until the sounds of Patterson faded behind her, replaced by the whisper of the wind across the open plains. She found a dry creek bed and collapsed, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her life was over. The small world she had carefully built for herself, her job, her meager room, her quiet reputation, had been shattered in less than an hour. She was a fugitive framed for a crime she had only witnessed. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers finding the cool metal of the locket her mother had given her before she passed. It was a simple silver oval worn smooth, with time containing a tiny faded portrait of a woman, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. It was the only thing of value she owned, the last tangible piece of a home and a life that felt a universe away. She clutched it tightly, the metal digging into her palm. It was a reminder of who she was. Not the thief they called her, but Margaret Walker, a daughter, a survivor. That night, huddled beneath a star-strewn sky that offered no comfort, she knew she couldn't go back. She couldn't go east, where word might have already spread. She had to go west, further into the frontier, where a person could disappear, where the past could be outrun. She had seen an advertisement tacked to the general store board just last week, a scrawled note seeking a cook for a remote ranch in a town she'd never heard of, Creswell. It wasn't a plan for a new life. It was a desperate grasp for survival. With the ghost of a handsome, ruthless man haunting her thoughts and a false accusation hanging over her head, Margaret Walker set her face to the west. Her journey to Creswell was not for a job. It was to find a place so quiet, so forgotten that even justice in its cruel, mistaken form could not find her. Creswell was less a town and more a pause in the endless rust-colored expanse of the frontier. It was a single dusty street, flanked by a handful of sun-bleached wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon whose doors seemed permanently closed, and a livery stable that smelled of dry hay and resignation. The wind was the town's most prominent citizen, whispering through the cracked facades and carrying with it a palpable sense of isolation. As Margaret walked the length of the street, she felt eyes on her, not the curious glances of a welcoming community, but the narrow, suspicious stares of people who had learned that outsiders were a harbinger of trouble. Men leaning against porch posts fell silent as she passed, their gazes following her until she was out of sight. A woman sweeping her stoop stopped abruptly, pulling her child close, as if Margaret were a contagion. She learned the reason for their wariness soon enough. At the general store, while buying a small bag of flour with her last few coins, she overheard two old-timers talking in low murmurs. "Heard Thorne's men were out at the Miller place yesterday," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Offered him next to nothing. Told him it was that or get nothing at all when the bank forecloses." "Same thing they told the Jacksons," the other replied, shaking his head. "This Elias Thorne fella ain't buying up the valley. He's strangling it. Won't be long till the only deed left belongs to him." The name Thorne sent a shard of ice through Margaret's veins. It couldn't be him. It was a common enough name. But the description of his methods, the ruthless acquisition of land, resonated with the cold calculation she had seen in the bank robber's eyes. She pushed the thought away. It was paranoia, a ghost haunting her from Patterson. The directions to the Winters Ranch led her to the far edge of town, where the pretense of community gave way completely to the stark, unforgiving landscape. The ranch stood alone, a collection of wind-beaten buildings hunkered down against the vast, empty sky. It was the last holdout, a solitary island in the sea of land, being consumed by this mysterious Mr. Thorne. The place felt steeped in a grief as palpable as the dust that coated every surface. The fences sagged, the paint on the main house had peeled away to reveal weathered gray wood, and the garden near the porch was a tangle of dead weeds. It wasn't a home. It was a monument to neglect. Her knock on the heavy oak door echoed with a hollow finality. When it opened, the man who stood there seemed carved from the same hard, unforgiving material as the land itself. Samuel Winters was broad-shouldered and weathered, his face a roadmap of sun and sorrow. But it was his eyes that held her. They were slate gray, devoid of light or warmth, the eyes of a man who had slammed a door on the world and bolted it from the inside. "You the cook?" He asked, his voice a low rumble, devoid of greeting. She nodded, her own voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am. Margaret Walker." He didn't offer a handshake or a smile. He simply stared at her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were stripping away her layers, searching for the weakness, the flaw that would prove she was just like all the others who had come and gone. "Kitchen's that way," he said, stepping aside just enough for her to pass. The inside of the house was colder than the air outside. It was clean but lifeless, the furniture draped in a shroud of silence. It was a place where laughter had long since died. As she walked toward the kitchen, she saw him through the parlor window, his back to her, watching a small girl with hair the color of spun gold playing near a solitary oak tree. He watched her with a fierce, suffocating intensity, his posture rigid, a sentinel guarding the last precious thing in his world. This was Samuel Winters, not just a cold man, but a man broken by grief, desperately holding on to the one piece of his shattered life that remained. And Margaret, a woman running from her own ghosts, had just walked directly into his. The kitchen was a space of stark functionality. A cast-iron stove, a long wooden table scrubbed clean, and a pantry with shelves that were more empty than full. It was a canvas waiting for color, for life. Margaret untied her satchel, hung her shawl on a peg, and rolled up her sleeves. Work was her refuge, the one place where her hands knew what to do when her heart was in turmoil. She found a sack of potatoes, some onions, and a piece of salted beef. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The rhythmic chop of her knife against the cutting board was a steadying sound in the oppressive silence. The sizzle of onions in the pan was a small act of defiance against the coldness of the house. She wasn't just cooking a meal. She was trying to prove her worth, to carve out a small space of safety in a world that had offered her none. She was here to disappear, to become so useful that no one would think to ask about her past. In 30 minutes, a rich beef stew simmered over the flame, its aroma filling the kitchen and creeping into the silent hallways of the house. She baked a pan of fresh biscuits, their golden tops, a stark contrast to the gray despair that seemed to seep from the walls. She laid out the meal on the long, empty dining table, a silent offering. Samuel came alone. He sat at the head of the table, which seemed impossibly large for one person, and looked at the spread without a flicker of expression. He picked up his fork and ate slowly, deliberately, each chew a measured evaluation. Margaret stood by the wall, her hands clasped behind her back, waiting for the verdict. This wasn't just about her cooking. It was a trial for her very existence. He finished setting his fork down with a quiet click. He looked up at her, his slate-gray eyes unreadable. "You done?" he asked. She stiffened, bracing for dismissal. "Yes, I was told this was a trial day." He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. "No one lasts more than one." He opened his mouth as the words of rejection already formed the final door to this last-chance sanctuary, about to slam in her face. "Papa, wait." The voice was small but clear, coming from the shadowed hallway. A little girl no older than 6 stepped into the light. She wore a simple yellow dress, her curly hair tied back with ribbons, her cheeks flushed with a combination of shyness and determination. She didn't look at her father. Her eyes, the same startling gray as his, but filled with a child's unfiltered hope, were fixed on Margaret. She darted into the room, a flash of yellow against the gloom, and ran not to her father, but to Margaret. She wrapped her small arms around Margaret's waist, holding on as if to an anchor in a storm. She stood on her tiptoes, her warm breath tickling Margaret's ear as she whispered loud enough only for the two of them to hear, "Don't worry, I picked you to be my mommy." Margaret froze the words, a physical shock rooting her to the spot. The world narrowed to the feeling of those small, trusting arms around her. This wasn't just a job. This wasn't just a hiding place. This was a child's desperate prayer. Samuel blinked, his iron composure cracking for the first time. "Abigail," he said, his voice strained. The girl didn't let go. She looked over her shoulder at her father, her expression bright and triumphant. "I sold my stories to Mr. Howley at the store. He said I was a real good writer. Gave me coins. I paid Miss June to write the advertisement." Samuel's brow furrowed, a storm gathering in his eyes. "You did what?" Abigail's grip on Margaret tightened. "I told you I wanted a mama," she said, her voice wobbling slightly but firm. "You never listened, so I found one myself." Margaret looked down at the top of the girl's head, her chest aching with an emotion she couldn't name. It was a terrifying, beautiful weight. She was an answer to a plea she had never heard, a last hope for a little girl in a house full of ghosts. Accepting this trial day was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting the fragile spark of hope in this child's eyes. It was a chance to disappear, not into obscurity, but into a purpose. And somewhere in the cold, silent heart of the Winters Ranch, against all odds, something had begun to thaw. Life at the Winters Ranch settled into a silent, grinding routine. Each day Margaret rose before the sun and the chill of the house a constant companion. Samuel was a ghost in his own home, a man of clipped sentences and heavy footfalls. He would leave a list of chores on the kitchen table each morning, a silent litany of tests. Mend the north fence. Clear the weeds from your mother's garden. Re-shoe the bay mare. They were tasks far beyond the duties of a cook designed to break her, to prove she didn't belong. Margaret met each challenge with quiet determination. She learned to splice wire until her fingers were raw, to tell the difference between thistle and thyme, to hold a horse's hoof steady against her leg. She worked until her muscles ached and her back screamed, fueled by the image of Abigail's hopeful face. She was fighting for her place, not just in this house, but in the world. Samuel watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. He offered no praise, no help, only silent judgment. But his tests were not the only obstacles she faced. A subtle campaign of sabotage began against the ranch. One morning, they awoke to find the north fence deliberately cut, a dozen head of cattle scattered across the open range. It took Samuel and Margaret 2 full days under the blistering sun to round them up, a grueling, wordless partnership born of necessity. Margaret, exhausted and sunburned, felt a flicker of shared purpose with the stoic man riding beside her. A week later, the stream that watered their small vegetable patch slowed to a trickle. Samuel rode upstream and found a crudely built dam of rocks and logs, clearly man-made. He dismantled it, stone by stone, his jaw tight with a fury he never voiced. Margaret knew with a chilling certainty that this was the work of Elias Thorne's men. The pressure on the last holdout was escalating from financial to physical. She wasn't just trying to win over a grieving family. She was helping to defend a ranch under siege. The constant external threat forced her and Samuel together. One evening, as they worked late in the barn, repairing a broken wagon wheel, their hands brushed as they reached for the same tool. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through the space between them. For the first time, Samuel didn't immediately pull away. He simply looked at her, and in the dim lantern light, she saw not coldness in his eyes, but a deep, weary sorrow. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice rough. "This isn't what you signed on for." "Abigail needs this ranch," Margaret replied simply. "And so do you." He didn't respond, but he didn't have to. A silent understanding had been forged between them in the shared hardship, a fragile truce in the war against the world outside their gate and the ghosts within their walls. Abigail, oblivious to the larger battles being waged, was the unwavering light in their small, embattled world. The bond between Margaret and Abigail grew not in grand moments, but in the quiet, everyday rituals that stitch a life together. It was in the smell of cinnamon and rising dough, as Margaret taught Abigail how to knead bread, and their hands dusted with flour, their laughter echoing in the once silent kitchen. It was in the careful, patient stitches Margaret used to mend Abigail's favorite yellow dress, a task she performed by the firelight, while Abigail read aloud from a worn book of fairy tales. Margaret would listen, captivated, not by the stories of princes and castles, but by the sound of the child's voice filling the lonely corners of the house. Abigail began to follow her everywhere, a small, bright shadow. She saw Margaret not just as a cook or a companion, but as a shield. When Samuel's grief would descend upon the house like a sudden storm, making him retreat into a stony silence, Abigail would seek out Margaret, slipping her small hand into hers. Margaret's presence was a buffer against her father's sadness, a promise that not all warmth had vanished from the world. Samuel observed this transformation from his guarded distance. The small, hard gestures of acknowledgement began, each one earned. One evening, Margaret stayed up late, mending a thick saddle blanket he needed for a long ride to the south pasture. Her fingers grew numb with cold as she worked by the dying embers of the hearth. The next morning, she found a warm soapstone bottle wrapped in flannel, sitting on the kitchen table, still radiating a gentle heat. There was no note, but she knew. A few nights later, he found her shivering by the fire, hunched over a book she was reading to a sleepy Abigail. The stool was hard and splintery, offering no comfort. The following afternoon, a new chair appeared in its place. It was simple, carved from a sturdy piece of oak, its back smoothed and curved just so. He had made it himself. When he walked into the kitchen for supper, she met his gaze and said, "Thank you for the chair. It's very comfortable." He just nodded, a faint flush rising on his weathered cheeks, but the silence that followed was comfortable, not strained. The ice around his heart was not gone, but it was beginning to crack. This fragile piece was shattered during a trip into Creswell for supplies. As Margaret was leaving the general store, she saw a group of men loitering near the saloon. They were loud, arrogant, their presence a blight on the quiet town. One of them turned, and Margaret's blood ran cold. It was one of the men from the bank robbery in Patterson. He had the same cruel sneer, the same restless eyes. He was one of Thorne's men. The ghost she thought she had outrun had found her. Fear, sharp and suffocating, seized her. She quickly ducked her head, pulling her bonnet low to conceal her face, and hurried toward the wagon where Samuel was waiting. All the way back to the ranch, her mind raced. Thorn wasn't just a name whispered in the general store. He was here. The man who had framed her, who had destroyed her life, was the same man trying to destroy Samuel's. That night, after Samuel and Abigail were asleep, Margaret lit a single candle in her room. She could not run again. This time she had something to fight for. She pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write a letter to Sarah, her oldest and most trusted friend back in Patterson, the only person who had believed her innocence. She wrote in a careful code they had devised as children, embedding her questions and anecdotes about recipes and sewing patterns. Is the new banker, Mr. T, as charming as everyone says? I hear he has family interests far to the west. I worry his reach might extend even here. She had to know more. She had to understand the enemy who was now on her doorstep. Her chance to post the letter came a few days later, but before a reply could possibly arrive, the threat materialized in person. A handsome carriage far too opulent for Creswell rolled up the long drive to the ranch. A man stepped out dressed in a tailored city suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He moved with an easy, predatory grace that made the hairs on Margaret's arms stand up. It was him, Elias Thorn. Samuel met him on the porch, his body a rigid line of defense. Winters. Thorn said, his voice as smooth and polished as his boots. I am Elias Thorn. I believe you know why I'm here. I've come to make you a final, generous offer for this land. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to stay hidden. If he saw her... Abigail, curious about the visitor, chose that moment to run out onto the porch. Papa, who is it? Thorn's practiced smile widened. He crouched down to her level. And who is this lovely little lady? As Samuel introduced them, Thorn's gaze lifted from Abigail and swept towards the house. His eyes, those same chilling winter sky eyes, passed over the window and locked directly onto Margaret's. Recognition dawned instantly. His smile didn't falter, but a cold, dangerous light flickered in its depths. He knew her, and she knew him. The man who held her past in his hands was now standing on her porch, trying to steal her future. In that silent, terrifying moment, Margaret understood. The siege of the Winters Ranch was not just about land. It was about her. She had to hide her recognition to play the part of the simple cook, because if Samuel knew the truth, he would send her away to protect his daughter. And if she left, she would be utterly, finally alone. The threat was no longer distant. It was breathing the same air, standing just a few feet away, and smiling like a gentleman. Thorn did not press the issue that day. He left with a civil nod, his parting words to Samuel laced with a veiled threat. A man must know when to protect his legacy, Winters, and when to accept that the world has moved on without him. The visit left a pall over the ranch, a tension that settled deep in the bones of the house. A week later, Thorn sought out Samuel again, but this time it was not a formal visit to the ranch. He found him alone on the open range, checking the southern fence line where the cattle had been scattered before. There were no pleasantries, no pretense of a business transaction. Thorn rode up not as a landowner, but as an executioner of a long-held grudge. Still patching holes, Winters. Thorn began dismounting from his fine black stallion. A futile effort. This entire place is rotting from the inside out. Just like you. Samuel turned slowly, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. State your business, Thorn, or ride on. Thorn laughed, a cold, sharp sound that didn't reach his eyes. My business is with you. You think this is about land, about cattle? You are a fool. A proud, stubborn fool, just as you've always been. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This is about my sister. Samuel froze, his face draining of color. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned into the harsh sunlight. You don't even recognize my name, do you? Thorne sneered. So wrapped up in your own misery, you've forgotten the family you destroyed. Elias Thorne. Ruth Thorne was my sister. The revelation struck Samuel with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled back a step, his mind reeling. Ruth, his late wife, had spoken of an estranged brother back east, a city boy who disapproved of her choice to marry a simple rancher who had cut off contact after she refused to leave this life behind. He had never met him, never even seen a picture. She wrote to me, you know. Thorne continued, his eyes burning with a righteous fury that had been simmering for years. In the beginning, told me how this place was wearing her down, the endless work, the dust, the isolation. I begged her to come home, but she was too loyal to you, too blinded by your selfish pride. That's a lie. Samuel choked out, his voice thick with disbelief and a dawning horror. She loved this life. She loved this ranch. She loved you. Thorne roared, his elegant facade cracking to reveal the raw hatred beneath. And you worked her into an early grave. You with your stubborn insistence on living like a pauper on this God-forsaken patch of dirt. A proper doctor, a life of comfort, that's what she deserved. But you were too proud to admit you couldn't give it to her. You killed her as surely as if you'd put a pistol to her head. Every word was a poisoned dart, finding its mark in the deepest, most vulnerable parts of Samuel's soul. The guilt he had carried silently for years, the secret fear that he had somehow failed her, was now being spoken aloud, given voice by the brother she had left behind. I'm not here to buy your land for profit, Winters. Thorne said, his voice regaining its chilling composure. I'm here to dismantle your legacy piece by miserable piece. I will take this land, I will erase your name from it, and I will take my niece. I will take Abigail back east and raise her as a Thorne with the education and the civility she deserves. I will rescue her from the same fate you condemned her mother to. This isn't business. This is justice. For Ruth. The truth of it was a stunning, world-altering blow. The sabotage, the pressure, the relentless campaign, it wasn't a land dispute. It was a deeply personal war, a vendetta fueled by a brother's grief and twisted by years of resentment. Elias Thorne, the bank robber from Patterson and the land baron of Creswell, was family. And he had come not to build an empire, but to reclaim what he saw as his blood right, and to utterly destroy the man he held responsible for his sister's death. The confrontation with Thorne shattered the fragile peace Samuel had begun to find. The guilt he had carried like a shroud for years was no longer a whisper in his own mind. It was a roaring accusation. He returned to the ranch a changed man, the nascent warmth in his eyes extinguished, replaced by the familiar, haunted gray. He retreated back behind the walls he had built around his heart. And this time they were higher and colder than ever before. He pushed Margaret away, his silence a weapon. He stopped speaking to her, his requests for meals left as terse, impersonal notes on the kitchen table. When she tried to talk to him to ask what had happened, he would simply turn and walk away, leaving her in a vacuum of cold rejection. He saw Thorne's twisted truth in everything. The calluses on Margaret's hands, the weariness in her eyes after a long day, it was all a reflection of what he had done to Ruth. He became convinced that Thorne was right, that this life was a curse, and that by keeping Abigail here, he was sentencing her to the same fate as her mother. His despair manifested as a terrifying paralysis. He began to neglect the ranch again, letting chores pile up his spirit broken. He spent hours staring out at the land he had loved, now seeing it only as a tomb. The thought of selling, once unthinkable, became a dark obsession. It was a way to save Abigail, to give her the life Thorne promised to atone for his sins against Ruth. Margaret found herself fighting a war on two fronts. Outside the ranch, Thorne's attacks escalated from subtle sabotage to overt aggression. His men would ride the property line, their presence a constant silent threat. A small fire was set in the far pasture, a warning that consumed an acre of dry grass before Samuel and Margaret could beat it out. But the more desperate battle was inside the house, against Samuel's consuming despair. "You can't give up, Samuel," she pleaded one evening, finding him slumped in his chair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. "This is what he wants. He's poisoning your mind with lies." "Are they lies?" He shot back, his voice raw with pain. "Ruth is gone, Margaret. That is the only truth that matters. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am too proud." The final, cruelest blow came a few days later. Margaret went to the well to draw water for the morning coffee and noticed a strange, oily film on the surface, smelling faintly of chemicals. She dropped the bucket, her stomach lurching with dread. She ran back to the house, but it was too late. Abigail, who always drank a glass of water first thing upon waking, was already sick. By noon, she was burning with a fever more violent and terrifying than the one she'd had before. Her small body was racked with chills and violent coughing fits. It wasn't a natural sickness. It was poison. Thorne's war was no longer about land or legacy. He was now willing to sacrifice his own niece to win it. The stakes were now life and death. As Margaret worked tirelessly to save the child, she was no longer just a cook or a caregiver. Every cool cloth she placed on Abigail's forehead, every spoonful of herbal broth she coaxed between her lips, was an act of defiance. She was fighting not only a fever, but the venomous hatred of Elias Thorne himself. She sent a desperate, frantic letter to her friend Sarah this time, with no code, begging her to take what she knew about Thorne to the U.S. Marshals. It was a long shot, a prayer sent into the wilderness. For days, she and a guilt-ridden Samuel kept vigil. He was a ghost at his daughter's bedside, his face a mask of agony, watching the consequences of his perceived failures play out on his child. He was on the verge of breaking, completely ready to sign away everything just to make it stop. And Margaret knew that she was the only thing standing between the family she had come to love and complete annihilation. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, the air growing heavy and still with a sinister charge. A sandstorm was coming. The wind began to howl, a low moan that escalated into a shrieking gale, throwing sheets of dust and sand against the ranch house. The world outside vanished into a swirling vortex of brown, isolating them completely. It was the perfect cover for an attack. Inside the house was a fortress under siege. Dust seeped through every crack in the walls, coating the furniture in a fine grit. The lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Abigail lay pale and still in her bed, her breathing shallow, the fever clinging to her tenaciously. Samuel sat by her side, his face etched with a despair so profound it looked like he had already surrendered. The deed to the ranch lay on the table beside him, a stark white flag of defeat. A thunderous pounding on the door cut through the roar of the storm. It wasn't a knock, it was an assault. "Winters." Thorne's voice, amplified by the wind, was a chilling command. "Open this door. I've come for my niece, and for your signature." Samuel didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Abigail, his spirit utterly broken. "Maybe it's for the best," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He can take her to a real doctor. Save her. He reached a trembling hand toward the deed and the pen beside it. No. Margaret said, her voice low, but resonant with the strength Samuel had lost. She moved to stand between him and the door, a final line of defense. You will not let that man win. The pounding came again, harder this time, the wood of the door groaning in protest. Don't make me take it down, Winters. Samuel, listen to me. Margaret set her hands on his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. His words are the poison, not this land. He is the sickness. Giving in to him is not saving Abigail. It's abandoning her to the man who did this to her. He looked from her face to his daughter's, his soul a battleground of guilt and love. He picked up the pen. Just as his hand wavered over the paper, Margaret stepped forward and threw open the door. Elias Thorne stood on the porch, flanked by 2 of his men, the wind whipping his long coat around him like a dark shroud. His face was a mask of triumphant fury. He strode into the room, his eyes immediately falling on the deed. A wise decision, Winters, he sneered. He's not signing anything. Margaret said, her voice ringing with clarity and conviction. She held up a letter, its paper thin and worn from travel. This arrived yesterday from a friend in Patterson. It seems the U.S. Marshals are very interested in a man named Elias Thorne in connection with a bank robbery. A robbery where the ringleader was so clever, he framed an innocent kitchen girl to cover his escape. Thorne's smile faltered his eyes, narrowing into dangerous slits. You have no proof? Don't I? Margaret's gaze was unflinching. She walked over to a small, dust-covered writing desk in the corner of the room, one she had noticed weeks ago, but had never touched, respecting the privacy of the woman it had belonged to. Ruth's desk. Your sister was a writer, Samuel. Abigail told me. She wrote stories, letters. She wrote everything down. Her fingers traced the edge of the desk until she found a small, almost invisible latch. A hidden compartment sprang open. Inside lay a small bound stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. At the very bottom was a single sealed envelope addressed in a delicate hand, for Samuel, when you need me most. I found this days ago. Margaret said, her voice softening. I never thought it was my place to look inside. But I think this is the moment she meant. She handed the letter to Samuel. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal. The wind howled outside, a chorus to the silent, desperate prayer in the room. He began to read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. My dearest Samuel. It began. If you are reading this, it means the sickness has taken me, and my brother has likely come to fill your head with poison. Do not listen to him. Elias never understood. He sees love as possession and life as a collection of comforts. He does not understand that my life, our life here with you and our sweet Abigail, was a choice. I knew I was ill long before I told you. The doctors in the city gave me a year, maybe 2. They offered me a sterile, quiet end in a clean white room. I chose this. I chose the dust and the sun and the hard work. I chose every single day with you. I chose to live, not just to wait for death. This ranch was not my prison. It was my freedom. Do not let him twist our love into a weapon of guilt. Live for me. Love our daughter. Never, ever let him win. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Samuel's cheek. He looked up, the years of guilt and sorrow washing away, replaced by a clarity and strength that seemed to radiate from him. The man who had been broken was whole again. He crumpled the deed in his fist. He stood facing Thorn not as a victim, but as a husband defending his wife's honor and a father protecting his child. "Get out of my house." Thorn, seeing his power evaporate, lunged for his pistol. But Samuel was faster. He moved with a speed born of renewed purpose, grabbing Thorn's wrist and twisting it until the gun clattered to the floor. It wasn't a brawl. It was a quiet, decisive act of disarmament. "My family." Samuel set his voice like stone, his eyes locking with Thorn's, "is standing right here inside this house. You have no place here." He shoved Thorn back towards the door into the raging storm. "Go." Thorn stared, his face a canvas of disbelief and thwarted rage, before turning and stumbling out into the blinding sandstorm, his men following close behind, swallowed by the chaos they had helped create. Samuel slammed the door, the sound a final definitive end to a long and painful war. As dawn broke, the storm cleared, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and unnaturally quiet. The sky was a pale, hopeful blue. The air, washed of dust, smelled of wet earth and sage. With the calm came the sound of approaching horses. It was the town marshal accompanied by 2 federal deputies. Margaret's letter passed from her friend Sarah to the authorities had worked. They had a warrant for Elias Thorn and his men, not just for the events in Creswell, but for the bank robbery in Patterson. They found them taking shelter in a ravine a few miles from the ranch, their arrogance washed away by the storm. Word of Thorn's true identity and his personal vendetta against Samuel spread through Creswell like wildfire. The townspeople who had once been wary and suspicious now saw Samuel not as a cold recluse, but as a man who had been silently enduring an impossible fight. A neighbor arrived with a freshly baked pie. Another offered to help mend the fences Thorn's men had damaged. The community, once fractured by Thorn's influence, began to knit itself back together around the Winters ranch. That evening, after the last of the well-wishers had departed, and Abigail was sleeping peacefully, her fever finally broken, Samuel and Margaret sat together on the porch. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken grief, but filled with a quiet, profound understanding. "He told me I killed her." Samuel said, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple. "For years a part of me believed him." "She chose you," Margaret said softly. "She chose this life. Her letter wasn't for him. It was for you." He turned to her, his gray eyes clear and filled with a gratitude so immense it needed no words. "When I read those words, it was like she was giving me permission to live again. But you're the one who taught me how." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "I told you this house was warmer with you in it. I was wrong. It wasn't the house. It was me." He paused, his throat tight with emotion. "You are the heart of this home, Margaret. You always have been." She squeezed his hand, her own heart too full to speak. He didn't ask her to stay this time. He didn't need to. They both knew she was already home. Months later, the ranch was reborn. The fences were mended, the house had a fresh coat of paint, and the garden near the porch, Ruth's garden, was bursting with life. Margaret, with Abigail's enthusiastic help, had replanted it, turning the once neglected patch of weeds into a vibrant tapestry of wildflowers and herbs. The land, once a symbol of Samuel's grief, was now a testament to their shared future. One late afternoon, as the golden hour light spilled across the valley, Margaret found Samuel standing by Ruth's grave. The simple wooden markers stood beneath a solitary oak tree where Abigail so often played. He had been spending a lot of time there lately, not with sorrow, but with a quiet sense of peace. He was sanding a fresh piece of wood, and when she drew closer, She saw he had added a new carving to the headstone just below her name. It was a simple, elegant wildflower, the kind Ruth had loved, the kind that now grew in abundance in her reclaimed garden. It was a beautiful, perfect sign, a way of honoring the past without being trapped by it. He looked up as she approached, a soft smile touching his lips. He wiped the sawdust from his hands and reached into his pocket. He didn't make a grand speech or a formal proposal. He simply took her hand, his touch gentle and sure, and slipped a ring onto her finger. It wasn't gold or silver. It was a simple band of dark wood carved and smoothed by his own hands, the grain warm against her skin. It was a silent, profound promise. A promise of shared sunrises of hardships, faced together, of a family forged not by blood, but by choice and resilience. Abigail came running from the house, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze. She threw her arms around both of them, her small body connecting them in an unbreakable circle. Samuel wrapped one arm around Margaret and the other around his daughter. Together, the three of them stood for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors. Then they turned and began walking back to the warmth and light of the ranch house, their shadows stretching long behind them, merging into one.